Cool. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming to what I hope to be a really informative lunch talk. The title of our talk is Existential Risks and the Future of Humanity with our guest, Cullen O'Keefe. In many ways, I think this is a fairly timely event. We're still in the midst of a catastrophic pandemic that has taken millions of lives around the world and disrupted all of our lives. And this may be a fairly mild pandemic compared to what may come. Russia, a nuclear superpower, is on the brink of invading a sovereign nation, and who knows how such power conflicts can play out. Every day, our seas rise higher and higher, threatening communities across the globe directly and global stability more broadly. And every day, we inch closer to a world in which technologies take over every facet of our lives, creating the conditions in which we may be vulnerable to their misalignment to our interests. If we're able to overcome these risks, then before us lies the opportunity for thousands of generations of prosperity and peace, giving us time to address some of our most entrenched injustices. I'm really grateful we have Cullen O'Keefe here speaking with us. Cullen is a lawyer and policy researcher interested in using law and policy to mitigate existential risks to humanity. Currently, Cullen focuses on improving the governance of artificial intelligence and promoting the idea of law as a useful tool for safeguarding humanity's future. In May 2019, they received a JD cum laude from Harvard Law School. Cullen currently works as counsel for policy and governance in OpenAI, is also a research affiliate with the Center for Governance of AI, and a founding advisor and research affiliate at the Legal Priorities Project. Before I turn it over to Cullen, please send over any questions you may have by sending me a private message. Also, after Cullen finishes their initial thoughts, you'll also have the opportunity to use the raise hand feature to unmute and ask questions. So without further ado, I'll let you take over, Cullen. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Manny. Can you hear me well? Great. Thanks, everyone. I'm super excited to be here today to talk to you about what I consider to be one of the most important topics facing humanity right now, which is existential risks. So in this talk, I'll try to advance 4 key claims, some of which I hope are uncontroversial, and all of which I think together make a pretty compelling case for dedicating one's resources to advancing human stability and flourishing by preventing existential risks. So the first claim that I want to make is that human extinction would be bad if it were to happen. The second is that human extinction is possible on timelines where we could realistically intervene. 3, relatedly, that we live in an extraordinary time vis-a-vis the prospect of human extinction. And number 4, by virtue of 3, you can help prevent extinction risks, therefore putting yourself in a great position to do good. Okay, so as I said, the first premise is that human extinction would be bad. This is perhaps understating it. And for many people, I think this is kind of an intuitive claim. The easiest case to kind of motivate this is just to imagine the horribleness of a single death of a loved one prematurely or in general, and multiply that by 8 billion. So every human alive going extinct would just truly be kind of an incomprehensible scale of horror. Almost certainly the worst thing that has ever happened, possibly excluding past mass extinctions. But I posit that human extinction is even worse than everyone alive dying, because just logically, if humanity doesn't go extinct, there will be more generations of humans. That's what that means. And combining the number of current and future generations in the absence of extinction, the number of people in the future will kind of far outnumber the number of people currently alive today. And since these people are in the future, it's theoretically possible that we can take actions that will kind of change their welfare. And I'll make the empirical case later that we can improve the future. So in general, again, human extinction is probably worse than everyone alive dying today. And importantly, I think making future generations worse off or preventing them is morally bad. I'm happy to defend this statement more in Q&A later. I know that one of the sponsoring organizations is the Yale Law and Philosophy Society. I'm sorry if I'm not getting the name exactly right. And so this is quite an interesting philosophical topic that dates back to Epicurus. But to motivate my kind of view here a little bit, most people agree that bringing a life into existence that is so painful as to not be to be worse than non-existence is morally bad. So we shouldn't kind of create lives that we know will be worse than non-existence. This is in part why I'm a vegetarian. So it's kind of, if you buy that premise, it kind of seems to follow naturally that the converse should be true, that bringing lives into being that are better than non-existence is morally good. You would need to posit some sort of asymmetry between creating good lives and creating bad lives to have the view that one is morally bad, but the other is not morally good. We can also kind of analogize to human life. So there's the famous Epicurean argument that death is not bad for the one who dies because there's nobody to experience the badness of death once dead. I hope that most people here reject that argument. We think that murder is usually bad for the person who was murdered, etc. But the answer is kind of subtle, right? Because Epicurus had a point. There's no one experiencing the murder itself. You could experience the events leading up to the murder, but not the actual death. And the answer, in my view, is that the counterfactual is what kind of creates the badness of death. Because the counterfactual to dying prematurely is having a longer or more extended period of happy life. And the same counterfactual applies to enabling future generations to come into existence and live long, happy, flourishing lives. So kind of by the virtue of thinking counterfactually, we should think that preventing that sort of happiness is akin to causing premature death. From this, I think it follows that human extinction would be very, very bad, on the order of badness of killing orders of magnitude more people than simply everyone alive today. And I would also go even further, as kind of Manny did, to say that it might be even worse than that, because the future could be even better than today, not just in terms of material prosperity, but also in terms of kind of the continued improvement of society in terms of equality, justice, and anything else that one might value. If we were to go extinct today, we would kind of forever foreclose on improving the human condition and the promise of a better future that we're all working towards in some sense. Okay, so hopefully you agree with me that human extinction would be very, very bad. But is it possible anytime soon? Obviously, our current understanding of physics is that all species will inevitably go extinct billions or so of years in the future, but probably not much we can do about that. But is it possible that humanity could go extinct prematurely, as it will, before the inevitable heat death of the universe? Well, more than 99% of species that have ever lived are already extinct, including some of our very close relatives, like the Neanderthals, for example. Earth has seen many mass extinction periods where more than 75% of species go extinct in short order. And ecologists kind of think that we may be entering such a period now, driven by primarily human-induced changes to the environment. So our prior that humanity could go extinct, just treating ourselves as a typical species on this earth, should not be too low. But we do have some good things going for us. We're not a typical species after all. So medicine and public health mean that we are probably much less likely than most species to die of natural diseases. Our geographic diversity means that a local natural disaster cannot wipe all of us out very easily, as it's true for many locally confined species. Modern agriculture means that we're much more food secure than any animal species ever, though of course access to this remains uneven, as is also true for medicine. And our kind of engineering abilities mean that we can address a variety of natural disasters, even including spaceborne threats like the asteroids, so that it's a bit less likely that we'll go the way of the dinosaurs, at least by natural causes. So one might be tempted to conclude that we're likely to be okay, but I think this would be a bit of a premature conclusion because in the 20th century, humanity woke up to kind of another possible source of extinction, which is ourselves. So this began with the realization that the tens of thousands of nuclear missiles stockpiled by the US and USSR could cause such widespread devastation that their smoke could block out the sun and therefore cause agriculture and therefore humanity to fail. This kind of threat wasn't realized, interestingly, until about 40 years after the nuclear age kind of began. And so it's interesting to think about how precarious the situation was without us even realizing it for the first 30 years or so of the Cold War. And this nuclear winter was perhaps the first anthropogenic existential risk that humanity became aware of. Well, those stockpiles have been dramatically reduced since their peak in the 80s. There are still nearly 10,000 nuclear warheads in great powers inventories. And as Manny said, the kind of prospects of conflict between nuclear powers, whether that's in Europe or the South China Sea or India and Pakistan, are far from kind of unthinkable. And so situations in which these could be deployed and cause widespread devastation, well, unlikely are far from out of the question. And then shortly after, humanity realized that we were causing global temperatures to rise, a much slower moving disaster compared to nuclear winter, but a disaster nonetheless. And while it's unlikely that climate change alone could cause human extinction, it's already devastating for millions of people. And we certainly don't want to find out what the worst case scenario will be. Okay, so this is in part why I think we live in an extraordinary time. So just in the lifetimes of, if not many of us, then many of our parents, we've become aware of two existential risks from anthropogenic sources. Having dramatically reduced the natural extinction risks, humanity now needs to grapple with the threats of climate change and nuclear weapons. And it's both far too early to count these out as existential risks and far from too late to meet these challenges. But perhaps more importantly, I think there are new challenges that remain just over the horizon. So as Manny alluded to in his intro, COVID has shown us that the world is not very well prepared for pandemics. Even in the most well-resourced countries, hundreds of thousands of people are dying, and our kind of our allocation of resources to help keep people safe around the world is even worse. But in many ways, kind of despite the enormous toll of COVID, things could have been much worse. COVID kills less than 2% of those it infects. Children and young adults are quite well protected. And we produced effective vaccines and therapeutics on timelines that people did not think were possible, frankly. Next time, we might not be so lucky. Diseases that are much more deadly are possible and have been observed. And with macro trends like increased land usage by humans, that's putting us into contact with more and more kind of species in the wild. Factory farming leading to kind of incubation of new diseases and antibiotic resistance. We're in dangerous territory for pandemics. But even more scarily, in my view, the technology and information required to make biological weapons and make them even more deadly than natural pandemics is becoming more and more accessible. The price and kind of technical knowledge required to engage in genetic engineering and other forms of biological engineering continue to drop. And I think it's unlikely that we're kind of prepared for a world in which thousands of people, have the ability to create novel deadly viruses on equipment that can, fit on a desktop, which seems to be kind of the direction that bioengineering is heading. There's also the issue of artificial intelligence, which is what I work on primarily. Humans dominate the species because we're smarter than every other species. We can't, run faster or, do anything stronger than other species. The thing that we have going for us is our individual and collective intelligence. But there's kind of no good reason to think that human intelligence is the upper limit on the kind of intelligence of all possible minds. And if a machine species, in quotes, were to come along that was smarter than us, we would, want to be quite sure that it was aligned with our interests, so that we don't lose the ability to kind of direct it towards ends that are beneficial to humanity. So that's, that's also on the horizon as an issue that we need to grapple with. And similarly to some of the other kind of trends that we've noted here, advances in artificial intelligence are kind of going faster than many people predicted. People used to think that games like Go and creation of human language in a way that is hard to distinguish from natural language were challenges that would not be solved for a long time, and they've already kind of passed us by and are now old news in AI research. So it's kind of unclear whether that we can kind of count on smarter than human AI being in the distant future. So by some kind of great miracle, all of us sitting here today are at the confluence of all these profound changes. But due to the kind of nature of human civilization, we also have more individual and collective agency over how humanity responds to these threats. Kind of in any century before ours, it would have been kind of unthinkable to launch a kind of international global effort to reduce existential risks. But that's exactly what we saw starting in the mid 20th century, and what I would argue is kind of required now. If we're successful in navigating these challenges, we may be able to steer humanity towards a more just, tolerant, and flourishing future. We can bend the arc of history more towards justice and broadly shared prosperity. But if we fail, we could lose it all. So by sitting here today, you are likely to be one of the most powerful members of the most powerful profession in the most powerful country on earth. And so, our position as elite lawyers to tackle these trends is immense. And I would argue it's, morally incumbent on us to at least consider whether we can work to address these challenges. Just sketching out kind of a few ideas of how one in your position might help these problems. We need academics to help develop novel approaches to addressing these problems, both from a kind of legal perspective, but also from a broader kind of policy and governance perspective. And we also need lawyers in government who can help the government rise to these challenges by taking those ideas developed in academia and developing them into sensible regulations, both at the national level and at the international level. And kind of, I would also argue, and this is what I do, until we have kind of government that is willing and able to act sensibly in these areas, industry will, for better or worse, need to take the lead on self-regulation. And so we need kind of ethically minded lawyers in industry who can design and implement self-regulatory approaches to reducing these risks. If you want to join in this challenge, I encourage you to reach out to the group sponsoring this talk or any of the groups listed here, which can help guide your kind of thinking and how to get involved. That's the end of my prepared materials. If you want to get in contact, here are some ways to do so. I've also linked to this presentation here if you want to refer to it later. And other than that, happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Cullen. Really appreciate you. Yeah, that was great. So yeah, please, anyone who has any questions, feel free to use the raise hand feature and I'll go ahead and call on folks. I've already received a couple of questions through my personal messages, so I'll go ahead and read a couple of those out. And in the meantime, feel free to use the raise hand feature. One of the questions is about perhaps you mentioned at the very beginning that how existential risks is bad. And you mentioned that, that perhaps that has to do with some sort of like well-being metrics and the fact that future generations won't be able to experience that well-being in it. And part of this question is about, is well-being maybe the only moral system within which we would be able to grapple with the badness of an existential risk? And yeah, just generally to talk about like the sort of moral actions that we do day to day and how this can influence these risks.
Yeah, so I'm quite consequentialist in my reading, so I kind of leaned into that a lot. But I think a number of people would argue that there's a variety of moral theories under which human extinction would be quite bad. So another kind of way to think about it, which I believe goes back to Burke, is thinking about a kind of intergenerational compact between past, present, and future generations, where the present generation kind of inherits the long chain of human advances and toils from the past generations, and has it in usufruct for our lifetimes, but kind of owes it to the future generations to carry on the chain of transmission of human society and culture and value to future generations. So there's kind of a virtue, I guess, theory under which it's a generational virtue to behave responsibly with regards to one's kind of endowment. I guess similarly, I think there are deontological theories under which this makes sense. We already kind of talked about the badness of preventing future generations in terms of the welfare effects it would have, but you could easily kind of apply the same case to, if not perhaps a rights-bearing theory, at least like a duty-bearing theory, that kind of our duty to moral patients, like members of future generations, is to kind of treat them with respect, which would be incompatible with allowing human extinction to happen.
Yeah, thank you. Another question that I got is, well, basically, you're speaking to a room of sort of, elite lawyers, let's say, or future lawyers. And I guess the question is more about if you can talk about the potential limitations of an elite-led movement, and if there is a role for, more democracy in this vision, and if there are ways that we can maybe support broad-based movements surrounding existential risks, or perhaps if there are reasons why maybe structurally such things may be difficult.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it is important, because part of the great injustice of extinction risks is that the people benefiting from these technologies the most are already tend to be wealthy elite people, and we kind of owe it to the broad masses of humanity on whom these risks are being imposed, almost always without their consent, or sometimes even without their knowledge, to kind of try to counteract that in whatever ways we can. So the countries that have benefited the most from fossil fuel extraction and production are tend to be quite wealthy, but the people who are suffering the most from it are the global poor. And similarly, the groups that will benefit the most from advances in AI and advances in genetic engineering and biotechnology are likely to already be the rich. So I see it as quite a egalitarian kind of move against the unilateral imposition by the wealthy of enormous risks, and we kind of owe it to the whole of humanity to kind of try to counteract that. I mean, ultimately, also, the most powerful forces that we have in these fields will be legal mechanisms imposed by democratic governments. So, trying to get people bought into the idea that that these risks are worth taking seriously is quite important to that, obviously. There are also, I would say, limits to the kind of democratic angle to this, in the sense that a big part of why climate change is underinvested in is that the present generation votes, but not the future generation. So, I think there is a place for people to act as a moral corrective to the failings of kind of small d democratic policy by advocating for more morally enlightened policies. But I think that doesn't at all abrogate the kind of inherent unfairness of the way that existential risks are being imposed on kind of humanity as a whole.
Yeah, no, thank you. Got a couple more questions here as well, and if anyone would like to raise their hand as well, I will gladly call on you. You mentioned a few of the risks that you are sort of aware of, and that seem existential. And I was hoping that maybe you could lay out and maybe create what, based on the evidence that you've seen and that others have gathered, what may be a priority list of risks within our lifetimes, and maybe just broadly talk about some of the ways that we can begin to tackle or address these.
Yeah, I would say my guess at what the most kind of likely sources of human extinction in the next century, let's say, as kind of like a timeline that like we could reasonably expect to kind of have some effect on, would be AI. I think that AI seems quite sci-fi, but I think the basic premises of why we ought to worry about it are actually quite sound, and indeed have like a decent amount of empirical backing. I think I'm also quite worried about biotechnology. I would say it's probably the number two thing I'm most worried about. I think the one thing that the one thing about biotech is that it's hard to imagine a pandemic killing every single person, or enough people that there wouldn't be a sufficient population to carry on humanity. But I don't want to place too much weight on that kind of model. It's certainly possible that that's wrong. And then I would say nuclear war continues to be kind of a huge risk. Number three. Similarly, like there are some good reasons to think that even nuclear winter wouldn't kill everyone. All the nuclear powers are in the northern hemisphere, and the models are that the southern hemisphere, the climatic impacts of nuclear winter would be much less devastating, and that you could probably continue to have agriculture at a scale that could support thousands of people. Again, like not to downplay how unprecedentedly awful that would be, but whether it would like truly foreclose the continued existence of humanity is a bit doubtful.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll send it over to Lorand for their question.
Great, thanks, Cullen, and thanks, Manny, for setting this up. A really interesting conversation. I had a question for you about sort of intersection between existential risk and lawyering. In some ways, I think it makes sense to like focus on lawyers because like it's a privileged, influential class in this country. But at the same time, like law is very backward looking. Like we base a lot of things on the common law. We base a lot of things on precedent. We base things on a 200-year-old document. And I'm just curious if you've thought at all about like how your work as a lawyer, like what tools do you have as a lawyer that maybe you don't have in other professions, and how do you sort of cut through some of the more backward facing aspects of law and its ability to make change? Yeah,
that's a good question. I I'm a bit more pessimistic about like litigation approaches to these problems for the kind of reasons that you point out. There are that's not to say that we shouldn't try them. Like there are definitely interesting, especially in Europe, efforts to litigate issues around climate change and how it's kind of in violation of our duties to future generations. But certainly in the US, that's a hard case to make for a number of reasons, including a lot of the ones that you point out. I think I would recommend taking a kind of like engineering approach to the problem, legal engineering. So thinking about how we can use the toolkit that we learn in law school and from practice to design mechanisms, institutions, regulatory regimes that shape people's incentives in the right way with regards to these technologies, and generate a verifiable kind of compliance with risk reduction measures. So it's a different type of lawyering than I think the kind of first one that we're taught, which is a very like litigation centric model. But it takes some seeking out to like learn those types of legal engineering skills. But that's kind of what I think one of the better approaches is. I mean, that said, I don't want to overplay the importance of law. It's, there's political science and public policy problems as well that lawyers aren't necessarily the best people to address, or the only people that can address. And of course, there's also scientific problems that lawyers will need to think about how to synergize whatever regulatory apparatus we dream up with the kind of technical safety work that our kind of counterparts in the STEM fields are working on.
Yeah, thank you. Got another message with a clarification. And again, feel free to send direct messages to me or raise your hand. But just a clarification question. And basically, do you think that given our advances in the modern day, that we are now in a sort of like position, an extraordinary time where we are at greater existential risks than in previous generations, or that we are at fewer risks to humanity as a result?
Yeah, it's a good question, because as I mentioned, there's kind of been a likely reduction in the natural risks due to a bunch of things, but also all these anthropogenic risks coming up. My guess is that we're in a higher risk today. And the reason is that, we managed to survive, many centuries of these kind of natural background levels of risk, which would kind of, imply a pretty low probability per century on human extinction, because we have, decent evidence of survival against it. There's interesting kind of philosophical discussion we can have about things like survivorship bias, basically, and whether how strong we really ought to consider that evidence. But we'll put that to the side for the purposes of my first stab at an answer at this question. I think that the risk of extinction this century is appreciable in the sense that it's worth people actively thinking about and addressing. And I don't think that was ever really the case before. At least, again, the evidence of humanity's continued survival seems to suggest that the natural level of extinction risk was not such that we got, such that it's an astronomically tiny miracle that we survived. So I guess I do think it's higher today as a result of the anthropogenic risks, and that's in part what motivates my belief that we live in an extraordinary time vis-a-vis extinction risk.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is, and you sort of touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can dive a little deeper. But it seems like a lot of the value of reducing existential risks to humanity come from us preserving the existence and well-being of future generations. Do you think that there are tensions between our work to preserve the well-being of currently living people and future living people? And are there any ways or any initiatives that can help us bridge that possible divide?
Yeah, so I think there's more synergies than tensions. For a number of reasons. So human progress tends to build on itself in a lot of ways. So the material aspect is the most clear. Improvements in the standard of living and productivity and things like that tend to drive further improvements in those same things. And so by sacrificing those in the present, we essentially sacrifice compounding growth, which is not necessarily good for the future generation. Similarly, with advances in other values like justice, you had to go through the highly flawed nature of like the original Constitution to get to the 13th and 14th Amendments to get to the Civil Rights Act, et cetera. We don't, the likelihood of going from 0 to 100 on things like equality in the future sooner than you would get to by kind of advancing incrementally seems pretty unlikely to me. That's the core tension of existential risks is that there's economically an externalized harm from the consumption and production patterns of present generations onto the future generations. We externalize the risks, and so I think that the framework that I find compelling is just a typical one of just as a model for reducing climate change is to reduce the externalized harms from carbon emissions, or that's the typical way that we think of kind of environmental problems is reducing those externalities. So too is it incumbent on the present generation to reduce the externalized harms from kind of our technologies on future generations. So that's the kind of philosophical framework that I think we like thinking about that tension when it exists. But I would also expect that there's much more synergy than one might think. I'm also generally in favor of making altruistic kind of notions towards future generations. So things like endowing institutions that are primarily aimed at benefiting future generations does seem like a good thing to me. But if we're thinking at a society level where we don't want to rely on pure altruism to kind of solve this problem, I don't think it's either politically viable or even necessarily a good idea to ask for sort of immense sacrifices from the present generation, even if in some sense kind of the moral stakes might we want to conclude that is desirable.
Thank you for talking about that possible tension. Got another question here. You mentioned your work in AI. I guess the question is about whether you can elaborate on the sort of risks that artificial intelligence can bring. I guess that could be a more technical question, but if in whatever way you want to take that, any sort of the risks that you foresee and the ways that we can help address that.
Sure. So I'm super happy to talk about this. So I guess the thing to start off with that actually I think has interesting legal analogies is just principal agent problems. So a lot of the law is aimed at solving principal agent problems, and the basic kind of insight of law and economics is that the agent's incentives are not by default the incentives of the principal. And you can think of AI systems as agents, right? We create them to try to do something. But instead of being bound by law, the AI agents are begun by code, and so are bound by code. And so what the AI agents our kind of goal when we're constructing AI systems is to come up with an algorithmic expression of what we want. And as kind of lawyers will be familiar with the kind of discussion of like rules versus standards, it's actually like just quite hard to come up with an expression of what we want in all circumstances. There are edge cases, the assumptions on which the rule was formulated break down. This isn't a problem most of the time because we can expect that failures will be not catastrophic. But if AI systems become sufficiently powerful that they, a failure would cause a catastrophic, event, then we could expect, the need to be sure that the instructions that we're giving an AI agent are kind of a complete expression of our wishes, the importance of that becomes higher as capabilities progress. AI failures have already killed people, with things like autonomous cars. So, the idea that they could kill someone is empirically already demonstrated. The question is whether the upper limits on AI capabilities are such that are sufficient to create an extinction risk. And if so, whether we will kind of be able to prevent those capabilities from emerging, or else make sure that they're kind of adequately bounded. And that's kind of the question that I'm working on, or the kind of broader set of questions that the field is working on.
Great, thank you. I got one more question from someone here, and then one question of my own. But basically, this person's question is about how perhaps when we think about existential risk, we think a lot about what are known as black swan events, which are very low probability events that have a high negative impact on society. But perhaps when we think about these risks, we generally don't think about the reverse of that. And maybe we can call those gray swan events, according to this questioner. But the idea is something that is low probability, but having a high positive impact. And the example that they gave is about COVID-19 vaccines being developed super rapidly. And perhaps maybe we're underestimating our ability to adapt and be resilient. And the question is, if you're aware of research being conducted in this area of like low probability, high positive impact, gray swan events or ideas that can be incorporated into the models or just generally into our research.
Yeah, absolutely. So this talk focused a lot on downside risk, but I also believe that we should try to benefit future generations if possible. The example that the questioner gave was an interesting one because the kind of framing of it was that the benefit was reducing a risk, right? So they often go hand in hand, but don't necessarily go hand in hand. So certainly, I think we should be thinking more about how to kind of advance the frontier of science and technology and kind of other sources of progress. When doing so, doesn't kind of risk creating extinction risks. And the kind of work that the emerging kind of progress studies movement is doing is kind of the go-to example for people that are thinking a lot about like creating those gray swan type of events. Tyler Cohen has written a lot about this. And so I would encourage checking those out. I think that they're quite synergistic with this in the sense that like to solve a lot of the problems, we need to make a lot of bets on individual projects that individually have a low chance of success, but kind of collectively the disjunctive probability that at least one of them succeeds is high. And similarly, bets around radical new forms of energy production and things like that kind of require a similar mindset where I remember back in like elementary school when we were learning about like renewable energies, it like kind of wasn't at all clear that like solar would be at least like it was never presented to me as like the kind of inevitable winner of this. And so back then I'm like happy that we invested a lot in kind of different forms of alternative energy, even though solar and nuclear seem to be kind of working out. It's good to spread your bets and try to find at least one or two that work.
Yeah, thank you. So the last question I have is, it sort of goes off of that last answer, but I was just wondering if there are any recent good news that you can share with us since you first started working on these existential risk issues, just to leave on a more positive note if possible.
Yeah, I mean, the good news on renewable energy, I think, is great. And I think climate change is more of a political problem than a technological problem at this point. We have cost competitive alternatives to fossil fuel usage. The the problems that remain ahead are number one, I think reducing the burdens to constructing nuclear power plants. Nuclear is one of the safest forms of energy available, not just in terms of climate change, but even in terms of near-term human kind of casualties. It's much less dangerous than the alternatives, but has been politically stigmatized for a long time, such that it's very, very hard to build new power plants. I think I could be wrong about this, but I believe it's been like decades since like a new nuclear power plant has been built in the U.S. And that's crazy. Like we're in a climate emergency. We need to the cost benefit of building new nuclear power plants is just so immensely in favor that we need to do it. Similarly, challenges around like land use regulation with solar are political problems at their core and not technological problems. And then there's also finally the international distributive problem, right? Which is that it's cheap to develop on fossil fuels in a way that it's not on other forms of electricity. And I think it's incumbent on us in the global north to kind of create a fair framework that powers the development of the global south, while compensating them for kind of forgoing the cheap route of development of burning more fossil fuels. Similarly for kind of deforestation and things like that. And that's essentially like a legal problem, right? Is like designing those sorts of trades. That's a classic kind of lawyering attitude. So that's in part why I don't want to say that climate change isn't an existential risk, but I think there's a lot of good news available, and I think the technological kind of advances are becoming more and more prominent. Electric vehicles are widespread. Out here in California, I see so many Teslas. It's crazy. And they're just one brand. Things in climate change, I think, are looking better than they used to. And we need to keep up the kind of political fight to make sure that that remains high on our leaders' agenda, because that's the main thing that kind of stands in our way from solving it.
Excellent. Well, Cullen, thank you so much for chatting with us and for all the work that you're doing. And thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully I'll send out a link to the recording soon. But thank you all so much for coming, and I'll see y'all soon.
Thanks, everyone.